enjoyed your plenary this morning. A lot of great stuff came out. And I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about that and asking you, you talked about that we are forging a new economy, a new knowledge economy, I think is how you refer to it. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about that? What does that mean exactly, the knowledge economy?
Well, I think there are a couple things going on that are going to shift the way knowledge gets created, organized, distributed, and used over the next decade. Among them is this really important revolution taking place in self-publishing and self-distribution. We know that there were about 250,000 commercially academic press-produced works last year, about 250,000 small press, and 500,000 self-published. We haven't wrapped our minds or our resources around how to capture and manage that stuff. And I think that's going to be one of the factors. Second, I think many libraries already are beginning to vote with their budgets in terms of where they're going to invest their resources. There's a declining investment in content. I think a lot are relying on consortial or statewide licensing to provide us a core of content. But I think there's a real general unwillingness to buy things that people are not going to probably read, and research libraries also are beginning to collaborate in much more aggressive ways around building those research collections and those global collections. I think also libraries are moving resources into other areas of new impact. In my talk this morning, I mentioned space. It's going to require continuing investment as we build for flexibility. I think staff is going to become a much more important, expertise is going to become a much more important part of the service suite that we provide. And that may or may not mean hiring always librarians. It may mean building a larger portfolio of academic and professional backgrounds in order to get the job done. I also think openness, although I think it has been modestly advanced. I think over the next decade we're going to see more and more institutions, universities, more and more funding agencies bringing expectations to the table in terms of the work of their own faculty. And I think that will shift a lot of the content that we pay for today into a different sphere. Now, whether we will accept what I talked about this morning of a sort of a repository chaos, where these works are being put in lots of different places, and we're not sure which one is the copy of record, which one is going to be cited, which one's going to be preserved, which one's not going to be changed. And that's where the importance of standards, I think, comes into play, and globally accepted identifier strategies that I think will make a huge difference. So I think all of those issues come to push a different type of marketplace for knowledge. I think there will still be a consuming community. I think it will shift over time to the end reader, to the student, to the faculty member, to the person who lives in town. I think some of that's already taking place in some disciplines in some fields. And to me, it retains the vitality and importance of the publisher and the extraordinary value they bring to taking an idea and moving it out ultimately to a well-edited, well-presented product. We have a lot of debate around print versus electronic. I think that's always going to be a tension, although I have to believe over the next 10 years we're going to see more and more of a community reliance on and acceptance of digital methods of reading material. Because the added value that the online presentation allows in terms of integration of functionality, multimedia, interactivity, new generations of young people, I think, will embrace and adapt to that perhaps more aggressively over the next 10 years than we have in our generation. So I think all of those factors and trends dictate a different type of economy for knowledge as we move forward.
You mentioned, and those are all very insightful ideas. One thing you did mention, in fact, you said it twice, and I found this particularly interesting, that this economy, there would be no information and service industry targeting libraries.
Yeah.
And I wondered, what does that mean for publishers and library vendors?
Yeah. Well, I think what it means to me is that the marketplace for what publishers and what library technology organizations do will shift from library acquisition to consumer acquisition. I think that will be an important part of the knowledge economy going forward. I also think libraries are investing. In my talk this morning, I outlined a series of maybe a dozen or more technologies that are increasingly relevant to the work of libraries, whether it be geographic information systems or artificial intelligence or mobile tablets and so forth. The whole range, those are not what I would call library technology company products. Those are products that exist in the general marketplace. The things that we have acquired from library vendors generally have fallen under the larger umbrella of library management systems, which in the scheme of things, if you list the technologies that really are viewed by libraries as important and fundamental to their services going forward, library management system, I would argue, has moved way down on the list. It doesn't mean that inventory control is unimportant, but we've built the front ends, the user front ends of a lot of these systems in libraries and in combinations of libraries to enrich discovery and to make it possible for people to refine and truncate and build a different type of individualized search. But I just think that general technologies are redefining what libraries are going to invest in. I also think that open source is going to play a very important role here. Even in the library management system space, I think that there is some potential for that type of open source approach to inventory control to advance. But I do think the types of products that libraries will use will either be purchased in the general marketplace or will be developed through teams of library technologists working together in an open source type of way. So it doesn't mean that those markets disappear. I just think they're directed in different ways.
I see. I see.
How about the impact of all of this on consumers? Right now, the library represents a channel so that consumers don't have to look in all areas or be aware of all the possibilities out there. But it also represents an opportunity, an equalizer. If you don't have the money, you can't otherwise acquire something that you could. As we lose that connection, and as these vendors are supplying things directly to users, how is that going to change some of that? Not just for academics, but for other types of libraries.
But I think communities, whether they be academic communities or public communities or school communities, I think there will be a business model that will subsidize individualized access to information, and that individuals will make choices in terms of the type of access they want to enable for themselves, the type of information they want to access and use. And I believe that business model of individualized subsidy in a community has some real potential. It sort of gets rid of all this stuff that we're buying through the library that basically never gets read, never gets cited. There was a Smithsonian Magazine article a couple of years ago that provided some startling numbers about the percentage of journal articles that just never are never used and never cited. And we know that at least in the university press environment, the number of volumes being produced of new scholarly monographs has, over the last decade, continued to plummet, in some cases below 300 copies sold. So I'm not sure we can sustain those models going forward. And I'm not sure libraries need to be in between the knowledge distributors, the publishers, and the knowledge consumers, the public and the university community. you know, we've been saying this for a long time, and we've not made much progress down this path. But I believe that given the economics of libraries, where we have so much that we need to invest in, either institutionally or collectively, that we've got to take a very different approach to content acquisition and content use in our communities. We're seeing libraries co-own collections. It's most obvious today, I think, in these off-site collection storage facilities. We're seeing more libraries co-invest in building collections together. Too Cool, the Columbia-Cornell combination, is a case in point, which has now been triplicated, quadrupled around the country in terms of institutions working together in that way. And so that means that even smaller amounts of material will be purchased, because libraries will be sharing collections in even more rigorous ways, not after the fact, but before the fact, in terms of the selection and acquisition decision. So I think it's going to be a very challenging 10 years for libraries and for publishers, but I don't think that we can sustain the current model. We've been, as I said, we've been like a Greek chorus on the side of the stage screaming at the academic community for decades, and we've made very slow progress. I also said that there's a relationship between quantitative change and qualitative change, and that there's enough quantitative things happening that ultimately will tip over into something dramatically different, and a real qualitative shift in how the knowledge economy works.
Well, this knowledge economy is, as you mentioned, you use terms like a time of upheaval, and you talked about that deconstruction was essential, but you also said that this transformation needed to be measured. And I wonder, what adjustments and changes do librarians need to make to remain viable and to continue contributing to their communities? Well,
we need to get out of the library. We need to be in those places where our users work. I talked about virtual, which is a trite expression, but I think to me, it's in the classroom, it's in the laboratory, it's in the workplace, it's in the hospital, at the hospital. And I think librarians, professional staff, need to be partnering in those arenas with the user community, faculty, students, businesses, and public communities. And I also think that we need to focus on the expertise that we bring to the table. And I try to outline a suite of services that I hear scholars and researchers asking for example. And we need to understand those, and we need to, in a measured way, develop those and introduce those into our service suite in working with those communities. I also think that there is I use the word virtuous today, in that we've been sort of islands of libraries. And if we can build that sort of radical approach to collaboration and really co-invest in very different ways than we have historically, our user communities will begin to think beyond the institutional framework, and we'll see the range of services and capacities that the library can deliver to them. They work in a collaborative way, the scholars. Community people work together in collaborative ways, and so libraries, I think, need to be a part of that culture of cooperation.
Well, it sounds like if we play our cards right, we'll have more influence than we've ever had before.
I hope so. That's my aspiration. I think we need to demonstrate impact and value. I think we need to secure respect. We need to be at the tables where decisions are being made. I use the word convener in my title. I think the library needs to be the place where ideas are shared, where issues are debated. Libraries should obviously steer clear of policy positions on things like immigration or gun control or health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. But they can be the place where information is enabled and where the diverse community perspectives on those issues come together, debate them, talk about them, and formulate new community and national policy directions.
I'd like to have a follow-up to that. Back in 2006, you wrote an article in Library Journal where you were sort of talking about the role of librarians and all the changes that were taking place and what that was doing to the concept of librarians. And I got the impression from that you were saying that library education hasn't kept up with some of the changes, radical changes that you were seeing. And today, every now and then you talk about librarians, and then sometimes you'll say people working in libraries.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about the future of librarians?
Yeah. So that 2006 Library Journal article was entitled Raised by Wolves.
Raised by Wolves.
The new feral professional in the academic library. And I was really addressing 4 trends. One was my observation in the academic library community. We're seeing a growth in the number of individuals filling traditional librarian positions without the benefit of the master's degree in library science. And those tended to be specialized positions. Tibetan studies librarian was one of the examples I used from my Columbia experience. Second, I also referenced the expanding roles and responsibilities of the library. Educator, publisher, systems, and so we're hiring web developers, instructional technologists, fundraisers, human resource people, and if you look at the suite of professionals that work in libraries of all types, academic and public, I will argue that you will find a growing percentage of individuals in professional assignments who have credentials and degrees from a variety of other fields. The third point I made was, over time, I have observed that the things that librarians used to do are now being carried out by paraprofessional support staff and student staff. And so I've elevated, in many cases, the librarian to play a larger external virtuoso role in the community, which is a good thing. And fourth, I observed that a growing number of individuals were coming into the profession through, not through resident library degree programs, but through online degree programs. And I was not casting negative views on any 4 of those developments, but observing those 4 developments and wondering what that meant in terms of the socialization of individuals into an academic library community. I was very, very focused on the feral information professional, not on the feral librarian, which was a very important distinction I made in that presentation. Now, library education. So I've done teaching in library schools, been on the faculty of several library schools, and there's a mixed array of programs that have different strengths and different attractions. We've seen the growth in iSchools, where the focus is on information technology and information services as opposed to traditional librarianship. We've seen the growth in undergraduate programs, not necessarily BLS, but more information undergraduate programs. There's real growth taking place in that sphere. And many of the library schools have been offering specialized certificate and master's program outside of the library area. So master's programs in web development, in art, museum work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we have worked in ALA over the last several years to improve the working relationship and conversation between the library education community and the library professional community. We've just worked on a new set of recommendations to improve the process and communication around accreditation. And we have another task force which is working on what will the library profession look like in 10 years. Therefore, as we develop new standards for accreditation, how will they support that new set of professional expectations 10 years from now? So there's a variety of things going around the future of library education and professional preparation.
And you've just been elected, congratulations, President of the American Library Association. I assume you see that as a positive.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
But you've already done so many things with so many different organizations. And we're facing a very crucial time. So looking at specifically what your thoughts are, what your goals would be for the next year for ALA, if we can start at that.
Sure. I think one of our major challenges, and I did mention it briefly in my presentation this morning, is the challenge of diversity and inclusion in our field. We 10, 15 years ago recognized this serious shortcoming. We took a number of steps to try to grow the representation of individuals from underrepresented groups, librarians of color, in our field. I was involved in launching and fundraising for the Spectrum program, which is designed to help individuals from underrepresented groups to pay for their library education. And a couple of years ago, we were shocked to find out that over the past decade, the number of individuals, librarians of color in our field, had actually gone down.
That's amazing.
It is. So I think there are a couple of things going on. One, it is a competitive environment for really good students. So we need to get into high schools and colleges to really demonstrate that this is a career and that it can be a very enriching career. And I think that important pipeline type of investment is going to be critical. As students get into library education, we need to make sure that those programs are challenging, they're interesting, that we help deal with the financial challenges of graduate education. And once they've graduated, we need to make sure there are jobs for them to proceed into, and not just a job, but jobs that are interesting, have good work, that are in organizations that are not hierarchical and bureaucratic, and which frustrate people and ultimately, I think, encourage people to move out of the profession, because the competition for high quality individuals to work in our field is high, and fields which sit around us are going to be successful. I think salary compensation is an issue. Yeah. I think benefits is an issue. I think quality of work life, being able to work with interesting people and interesting projects, all those things need to be upgraded. So that's number one. Number two is, I think we have seen over the last several years ALA presidents build a libraries transform strategy, that we truly have an impact in the communities that we serve. We do have an impact in sort of the national areas of national agenda, education, research, social justice. And now the current president has extended that to talk about expertise in the library, that we're someone who should be called upon to step in and help organizations, individuals, groups, to have the information they need to make good decisions. My thrust, my extension of that, is what I call Libraries Lead. I think one of the challenges we face in the next period is making sure that we who work in this field have the ability not only to lead within our organizations, and I'm not talking about directors, I'm talking about everyone having a leadership sphere and impact in their organizations, but being leaders in the communities that we serve, on the campus, in the city, in the corporation, at the hospital. I worry about leadership in national information policy issues. I think that's one of the major gaps that we're facing at the very time these information policy issues are becoming more politicized and much more complex. Someone who has the chutzpah, the knowledge, the savviness to go into a congressional office and have the message and influence behavior. I think that's a big issue going forward. So how do we provide leadership opportunities, growth opportunities for people in our profession? I think that's one of the things that we'll be focusing on in the next year.
I wanted to mention a couple of other things for just quick comments. We do have a new Librarian of Congress.
Yes, and I worked with Carla in Baltimore when I was at Johns Hopkins. So
Excellent.
I had a very good, close working relationship with her.
Well, most people seem to be very happy and
Yes.
feel that this is a positive.
Yes.
But one thing that has come up in some of the discussions has been the future of the Copyright Office.
Yes.
So as head of ALA, how do you see that issue, and do you think it will become an issue in the coming year?
Definitely. I've been working on copyright for the last 2 decades. In 1996, I spent 3 weeks in Geneva as part of the U.S. delegation at the World Intellectual Property Organization treaty negotiations. That was an eye-opening experience. And from that, I've been able to move through a long period of involvement, advocating for our users in copyright law, testifying before Congress, doing some writing and presentations around it. And one of the challenges I see moving into the ALA presidency is building a relationship between the American Library Association and the Library of Congress. It's weak today. I think there's opportunities there for a rigorous, robust partnership that will advantage not only the Library of Congress, but libraries nationally. And one of the areas of great concern in the library community is the future of our copyright law and the effectiveness of the Copyright Office. And I spoke to this, with several comments I made this morning, in that as information has moved online, our copyright law generally does not reflect the reality of working in a networked information environment. And I served on a group called the 108 Study Group. 108 is that section of the copyright law that enables exceptions for libraries. And we wanted to revise and upgrade that law. But the 20 people who worked for 3 years on that 108 study group, representing all sectors of interest in the community, could not really come to agreement around how to achieve that transition. And so we have worried in the library community that opening up the copyright law would subject us to real high risk in terms of the exceptions and limitations that we've enjoyed to get our work done, but also the general application of fair use. And so the location of the Copyright Office and the leadership of the Copyright Office is absolutely critical. There's been some movement to move the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress and to put it with Commerce. I think that would be a bad idea. I think there's value in the chief knowledge organization in our national government continuing to provide oversight for how information is managed from a legal perspective. And I think the director of the Copyright Office needs to have a balanced view, not swinging to either side, but copyright law in this country works best when it is balanced. And the director of that Copyright Office should have that balanced strategy. So we'll be working very closely with the Library of Congress, we ALA. We're part of a Library Copyright Alliance, which brings together a number of organizations, and we'll be in conversation, as I'm sure the media and publisher community will be as well, with the Library of Congress to really move the leadership forward for that important office.
Another thing that you brought up this morning in the Q&A following your presentation was the current situation for K-12. So looking, certainly in your position as president as well as just as one of the leaders in our field, could you comment? I mean, we've talked a lot about the needs of academic libraries, but there's that.
But there's a continuity here that we need to value, an ecosystem of libraries, if you will, where we see the school library community as foundational. That's where young people get their basic understanding of literature, the understanding of how to locate information. And over time, from kindergarten or even preschool through high school, the level of knowledge and sophistication prepares them for life, for careers, for successful higher education experiences. And if that piece of the puzzle is weakened, as I believe we're seeing it happen today, then that throws the rest of the ecosystem into some difficult space. And it's not universal, but we're seeing communities and states that are closing school libraries. We're seeing them move the school librarians out of the library into other type of administrative roles. We're seeing them staff the school libraries with individuals who do not have the educational credentials. Some states have legislation that mandate school libraries, that mandate the credentials of the school librarians. Those states have generally done better than the states that do not have that sort of that state legal infrastructure. We also have a very important piece of federal legislation, Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which has built into it the potential for significant funding for school libraries. And we're now in the process, we meaning the American Library Association and others, are involved in working state by state to make sure that at that level we've got state guidelines in place. So as states begin to apply for those funds, there is a clear opportunity and provision within their regs, their regulations, to direct some of those funds into school libraries. So on one hand, we're having this sort of horrific problem around the loss of school libraries and school librarians. On the other hand, we've got some good models in some states where that's being protected. And at the national level, we're seeing some progress in new funding to support the work of school libraries.
One last thing is something that you've talked about, but also our other keynote speaker this morning spoke to it, and that has to do with the broader, moving outside the United States and looking at some of those international connections. And a lot of the issues we've been talking about, whether it's copyright or funding or whatever, are really global issues today.
Yes, yeah.
So could you comment on that? Just one last area.
Yeah, so I've worked very closely in the international community, largely through IFLA, but the institutions at which I've worked over the years all have had very active, strong international relationships and partnerships. Just a couple weeks ago was at a meeting at Harvard between a group of U.S. library leaders and Chinese library leaders talking about the working relationships between the two countries and what were the common grounds that we could work on and develop. I think that we're seeing several areas of opportunity. One of them is policy, and I worry about international policy development, particularly when it involves a treaty and the U.S. is required to adopt that treaty and pass legislation to implement that treaty, and when the provisions do not align well with the traditions, the culture, and the legislative realities of this country. We saw that when the terms of protection for copyright were increased in Europe from 50 to 70 years. We had the similar movement in this country. We had database legislation to protect databases in Europe. We had database legislation introduced here, which we eventually killed off, thankfully. We now have the Marrakesh Treaty to help provide content to print-disabled individuals, and we have to implement that within the states. But there are interesting and important issues and conflicts around that. Telecommunications knows no international boundaries. So network neutrality, as information flows over networks around the world, we could have some real differences in terms of how groups of countries and how individual countries deal with it. The right to be forgotten, which is a very strong movement in Europe, to allow individuals to have information which is online or in publications to be removed. And they're putting a lot of pressure on the companies in the US, like Google, to implement that. And to me, it runs smack against our traditions in this country of intellectual freedom and open access to information. If we're going to start pulling stuff out because we don't like it, we're changing things because somebody is concerned about it, then I think the historical record is being altered, and that's pretty dramatic. So in the policy arena, I think you're absolutely correct. I think we've had less success in what I would call collaboration. So we have Digital Public Library in the US, and we have Europeana in Europe, and there's other wonderful examples in other groups of countries and libraries, nations around the world, but we're just beginning to look at how to connect those, how to knit those together into something which provides a much richer and more extensive group of digital stuff for our users to have access to. I think the interlibrary loan, international interlibrary loan, it's important, but it's never been extensive. And certainly as more and more information is presented online digitally, the demand for access to some of those publications could go down because they're openly available. And Europe has taken in some countries in Europe have taken a more aggressive approach to open access than the United States has. And so we're seeing lots of new content available from countries around the world that historically we had to request through interlibrary loan or document delivery.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question, and that regards open access and the open resources and the tools that it enables. How do you think that's going to impact scholarly publishing?
Well, I think it has had an impact on scholarly publishing. I think we've seen more and more individual scholars at least be aware of this issue. Obviously, their responsibility is to get grants, to conduct research, to produce quality education, classroom learning, and it's always surprising to them when we educate them around their ability to control their intellectual property, that they actually can request a different license, that they can actually alter the license that they signed with a publisher. I think publishers have realized that that either through institutional policies or federal funding agency policies, this is shifting. I think that's going to have an impact on research papers. I think it's going to have less of an impact on the scholarly monograph because they generally don't involve funding, external funding. I think there's a parent revolt around the cost of textbooks. I think it bubbled up very slowly, but I think there's a pretty deep anger among parents and students around what they have to pay. And so I think there's going to be a pretty robust open educational resource strategy developed over the next 5 to 10 years.
How do you think that's going to impact the economic model?
I think it will have a tremendous impact on the economic model. I think we're seeing in some fields some very early pilots where scholars who work in a particular educational area, discipline, are putting content together and making it openly available, or what's the right word? Whatever it costs to do it, to get that. In other words, it's not a profit model in work, but it's covering the cost of production. Yeah, cost recovery. I think that the research data stuff has raised another suite of issues. I remember at Columbia when all this began to come to the table about 10 years ago, we decided to go around office by office in the science, engineering, and medical health sciences and ask the faculty, researchers, where's your research data? And a large percentage of them didn't know. A lot of them would go to their desk and open a drawer and say, well, it's on this thing. And floppies or hard disk or, and so forth. And so it was very clear that they were not prepared as individuals to manage that. And so therefore institutions and national funding agencies had to step up to help deal with that. The fact is that most scholars, most researchers do not read a research paper for the first time in the published journal. That's a fact. They are part of networks of scholars and researchers on a global scale that move papers back and forth all the time, either pre-pub or post-pub, and that's the way they learn about new research that's being carried out around the world. And I saw a thing on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago about Watson, the IBM machine, and they did a test, and they compared how individual researchers performed in identifying new research and how Watson, it was actually the human researchers did a great job, but Watson did a better job. And so when you're dealing with severe illnesses or important scientific advancements, knowing everything can be important. And so I think we're going to see more machine-driven data and research gathering strategies. Whether it have the rigor and expense of a Watson, I don't know. But I do think that there is an expectation that there's better ways to find and discover new research than doing it by ourselves, or even relying on librarians.
Going back to your presentation this morning, you talked about information policy wars. Could you kind of summarize? We've already talked a little bit in light of your position at ALA next year, but just in general, how do you see all of this coming out? And could you give us a little bit more information on some of the various different sides or things that are driving?
Well, there's a number of things that are going to happen in the next Congress. We know that LSTA, which is the primary library funding legislation, is coming up for renewal. And we need to make sure that that's sustained and hopefully extended in terms of new funding. We know that there's going to be a probably early attention to patent law rather than copyright law, and particularly with the vacancy in the Copyright Office. But we need to be prepared for efforts to rewrite American copyright, and that might be influenced by international developments. We know that telecommunications legislation is coming up for renewal and rewrite, and that's a very dynamic sphere. And so, and this whole continuing debate around network neutrality, which to me is an important social justice issue, actually, is going to lead to a lot of conversation and debate among the players. So I think there'll be a lot of things that will challenge us. National security has been an ongoing area of debate over the last, since 9/11, as it affects the ability of governments and security organizations to monitor what's going on, checking out books in libraries, searching databases and the internet in libraries, telephone conversations. The library community has always taken a very strong position in terms of intellectual freedom and privacy, and I think that's going to be a constant debate in our community. You know, we're not disloyal. We understand the importance of national security, but we also want to be sure that we don't violate the longstanding provisions of our Bill of Rights, which protect speech and protect privacy. So I think those are the types of things, and I think they take on a warlike character to some extent, because there's so much at stake in these areas.
And it's above and beyond libraries.
It is way beyond, and therefore I think libraries need to do several things. I actually skipped over this in my conversation this morning. We need to be knowledgeable about what's going on. We need to learn how to advocate and educate within our own communities. We need to be able to go into our state capitals, our national capital, and into international arenas and push for the types of legislation and laws, and take positions in court cases that will have an impact. We need to establish what might be really awkward coalitions with other companies and organizations that we normally would not spend time with. Right. But to advance these issues, we need to sort of hold our nose and get it done. And we've seen lots of examples of that over the years. So I think we need to be smarter as information policy boots on the ground, if you will, to try to deal with this next period. Now, obviously, next Tuesday we're going to know a lot more than we know today, not only in terms of who sits in the White House, but also what that congressional makeup will be. And I think that will drive a lot of these policy issues.
Another broader concern that you highlighted this morning is managing all this information and getting a control. And we're talking more about journals or books. I mean, somebody mentioned emails and videos. I mean, just a plethora.
I had a litany of 20 items.
Yeah, you
did. So this is one of my things I've been marching around the world talking about. As I said, we've done a modest job with preserving our print and analog record. We've done a relatively poor job in protecting the things that exists in print or existed in print, which we've now made available digitally. E-journals, for example. We've created a couple of collaborative systems. One is called Portico, which sits under the Ithaca umbrella, and another which is Locks Clocks, which is a distributed model that Stanford played a very important role in advancing. In both cases, those two e-journal repository strategies, under 20% of e-journals are actually being captured and preserved. Wow. It depends on publishers contributing the content and libraries funding the repository. It's a dark repository. What it means is if somebody goes out of business or something becomes unavailable or it gets destroyed for some reason, there is a backup. And that backup is incomplete and it's inadequate. In ebook area, We're doing nothing.
There's nothing. Yeah.
There's nothing. Now, there's a few ebooks that have trickled into these repositories, but this is a disaster, particularly when you think about the small publishers and the self-publishing that's going on, a large percentage of which is digital. It's not all digital, a lot of it's still print, but even there, I'm not sure what's going to happen to those print copies. But that's a huge, so I'm telling you, if we just sort of look at this published arena, we've got problems. But then when you add in all this other stuff,
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge. Social media,
It's
email.
overwhelming.
It's overwhelming.
It's
overwhelming. And, you know, I got pushback saying, well, we don't care. We don't need all that stuff. But we don't know if we need that stuff. And the fact is, we at Columbia, we had a series of Mellon grants to do some workflow and technology development and to do some case work. And we chose to go down the path of human rights, which was a big deal at Columbia in terms of education and research. And we started to collect tens of thousands of websites and web documents in the human rights area. And then we would discover that this stuff would change, disappear, go away. And so if somebody wanted to understand what was going on in human rights around the world, they would not be able to research it because the materials were not there. We also began to look at journals in particular disciplines, in looking at the references in the research papers and identifying the growing number of references to born digital stuff of various kinds, and then trying to find those materials and not being able to a growing percentage. As I said this morning, it's an issue of integrity. If you're going to cite something, I should be able to look at it to know what you've argued and your conclusions are accurate. If I can't, then I have to question what you've done.
It's validating the research.
Exactly. And I think the same thing applies to doing research about our world. A growing amount of the evidence of what's going on in the world today, economic, social, political, is not in print. It's in a born digital setting. Yeah. And if we can't retain and make that material available, then we're going to have a hard time writing the history of this period. And then I talked about this issue of repository chaos, where, you know, I used to put my paper in one repository. It was the publisher repository. Now I put it on my website, I put it on the university repository, I put it in a disciplinary repository, a format repository, a national repository, et cetera, a research data repository, and so on. Which is the copy of record? Which one gets cited? Which one gets preserved? So these are really tough issues. Yeah. And I don't have a solution.
Yeah. Oh, it's going to keep us all busy.
I just don't think I just think we're not going to be able to deal with it institutionally.
It's much bigger than any one institution or any one profession for that matter.
That's right. So we need to develop new strategies, and it's going to take money, because you have it's in some ways a collection development process. What are you going to capture and retain? You've got to be able to retrieve it, so you've got to have rigorous metadata type of capacity, and maybe machine-driven metadata will do that. And then you've got to have multiple backup copies, and you've got to refresh them. And you don't have to just preserve the content, you've got to preserve the functionality. Because if you look at a website, you navigate, and there's multimedia, and there's interactivity. And how do you preserve that? Stuff. You know, we had a very important African American scholar give us at Columbia his archives, and in that archive was 15 years of email on 7 different email systems. Wow! And so, what do you do with that? And one would argue that his interaction with his peers, and he worked in poetry, he worked in jazz, he worked in politics.
It's extremely important.
Extremely important. We're never going to understand his life and his impact unless we're able to make that email available to scholars and
letters
students.
and correspondence of the past. That's it. That's what it is.
Manuscripts. I mean, how many authors would type multiple manuscripts until they got it right? And the handwritten notes on the sides and the margins, which are, you know, that's what doctoral dissertations are built on. That's right. And now I'm not sure. I mean, do people retain their multiple copies? I suspect not. No. So are we rewriting the way disciplines will work by our failure to collect this stuff? Probably. It's
a big impact.
Yes, it is.
A big impact. A big impact. It's been interesting to listen to you talk because it shows that there's a need for libraries to try to exercise some power here.
Yes.
And try to exercise some influence.
That's correct.
And I was interested to hear you talk about ALA working with the Library of Congress, because those are the kinds of collaborations that we will probably need to exercise the influence that we are going to need to influence.
And you know, I think ALA and OCLC and LC, I think OCLC can be a player here as an international organization, and I'm hoping that will be a part of this conversation as well.
Nancy, did you have anything else?
Well, just one last thing is that you're somebody who's always been a strong advocate, and it's going to be interesting as one of those new skills for the future. I think we're all going to have to be much more willing to step out of that traditional role and be willing to get out there and in some cases fight for what we believe in. And that isn't something that, I don't know how well that's really being taught, but in practice, I think for most librarians, that's sort of a takes you out of your comfort zone
Yes,
in
it
terms
does.
of your daily
I agree with that.
Definitely.
You know, we do ALA Legislative Day every May, and bring people from every state into Washington and set up meetings for them with their Congress people and so forth. And we do training and workshops there. But this needs to be multiplied many times, because a lot of the work is not done in Washington, it's done in your city, in your county.
It's local.
And your state. And that's where a lot of the impact needs to be developed. And a lot of the leadership and advocacy needs to be advanced.
Jim, before we let you go, is there anything that we've missed? Is there any question that we should have asked you that we haven't?
You remember I cited History of the World Part 1. I think the opportunities are rich for the profession, and by the profession I'm casting it large in terms of the diversity of professionals that now are part of our work. I think national organizations like the Library of Congress, OCLC, American Library Association, and others need to step up in terms of the leadership that they provide and the coordination that they provide. We've seen other things happen with Digital Public Library of America, Hathi Trust, Digital Preservation Network, Duraspace, so lots of interesting combinations of professional players which are beginning to sort of unwrap some of these challenging issues. But when you look in at the local level of the library, I worry that there is so much duplication of effort. As I said this morning, why does every library have to have a acquisitions department, cataloging department, preservation department, digitization? Why can't we co-invest regionally in some of that? For the first time in history that I know it, Queens, Brooklyn, and New York public libraries are finding ways to work together. That was sort of like, oh my God, they're actually working together. But new leadership there has, I think, made a difference. Mayoral pressure, I think, was a factor. So I think there are different ways that we can sort of take care of what I call those mass production elements. The infrastructure requirements for the types of issues we've talked about today, I think we all have to co-invest in those. We can't build those at the local level. That's why Hathi and DPLA are so interesting, because of the national platforms that they represent.
They provide a model.
They provide a model. I agree.
and an example
Yes.
for people.
Yes. And I think that there are, I call it centers of excellence. Somebody pushed back at me this morning and said, how are we going to do all these things? Well, we don't need every library to have a copyright person. We could have a group of library-based copyright centers that would advise and work with. We don't need every library to have a web archiving program. We can co-invest and build those together. So I think we need to move it to the next level of collaboration. And I think that's one of the really important areas that I hope that we can work on over the next decade.
Well, you're somebody who's obviously the right man for the job here. You've got the passion, the experience, the
But I'm old.
knowledge.
I'm old. Yeah, so I really want to work with the next generation of professionals, people who are coming out of library education programs, people who are coming out of other professional fields, trying to create opportunities within the association and in other venues for the emerging leaders in our field, and to build an inclusive approach to the work of our profession.
Good luck.
Yes.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on your being elected to ALE presidency, and we really appreciate you taking time out to come and talk to us.
I enjoyed it very much.
It was a lot of fun, and of course we learned so much, so
Thank you.
thanks again.
Thank you.